Okay, so I have given you your culminating writing task, and that is the task that you're going to have to do at the end of the novel. When we get towards the end of reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, then you will do the culminating writing task. Culminating is a culmination. That means we're working our way toward that goal. And what we're going to do is we're going to write a narrative. We're going to write a story. Now, a narrative is different than an essay. Normally when I teach this unit, it's in January or February, and my students have been writing essays, and to them a narrative seems pretty easy. But because this is our first major writing that we're going to have to do, our first culminating writing task of the year, and because we've been out of practice, most of us, in doing culminating writing tasks for so long because of COVID and other things like the hurricane delaying school, we want to make sure that we're not thrown for a loop when we actually have to do this. We always want to have practice with our culminating writing task, the actual type of writing that we have to do. We want to have practice with that before we get to the end. And so when you look at your culminating writing task, you have three options, one of which I'm going to take away from you because I think it's a little too easy. But what you're going to do is you're going to rewrite a scene from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe from a different character's point of view. And you're going to write it in first person. If you know anything about being in my class, is that I normally don't allow writing in the first person. I always say don't do I and me and things like that. But you get to use first person, and that's why normally when we do this in January or February, my students just find this really easy. But I'm concerned, like I said, because so many of us have been out of practice with school, that writing a narrative might be a bit challenging at this time.
Good morning, faculty and staff. I just, at this time, need all those who are helping with the Chromebook passing out and things that are set up at the gym. Can you please report that way so we can get ready and get going with that? Thank you.
I'm not going to start over because that's just going to be a part of our learning experience, just like if you were in the classroom. Okay, so your culminating writing task, you are going to write a scene that you've already read, but you're going to write it from a different character's point of view, and you're going to write it in first person. And you get to choose which one you want to do. I'm going to take one of the options away, so you'll have at least two choices, and you will work on that. But what I want us to do is I want us to get some practice doing that now. So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that our culminating writing task is to rewrite chapter 2 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe from Mr. Tumnus's point of view. So I'm assuming that if you're watching this, we've read through chapter 2, and the first thing you need to do is you need to reread that chapter or that scene that you're going to write. In this case, it's the whole chapter. So you want to reread that chapter. I have done this in front of my students for years, ever since I started teaching ELA. Every time I write a culminating writing task narrative with them, I have to go back and reread the scene. Even though I've read this book probably 9 times now, I still have to go back and reread my scene to make sure it's fresh in my mind. So the first thing you want to do before you do the culminating writing task is reread the scene you're thinking of doing. For one thing, when I have students in class and I tell them to choose the scene they're going to do, I make them look at the scenes first, because a lot of times students get confused and they read the descriptions and they think that they're going to do a different scene than what they're actually supposed to do. They start rereading the scene and trying to write at the same time, and they get frustrated, and halfway through they want to stop. And if you're in my class, this is going to be a timed thing, so time is of the essence. You need to know beforehand, before you start writing, which scene you want to do, and you need to have read that scene again. Not just the first time. The first time you didn't know you were going to do anything with it. The second time you know exactly what you're supposed to be looking for, because you're going to think about things from that other character's point of view. So what we're going to do is we're going to write chapter 2 from, and in fact I say chapter 2, we're going to write from page 11 through halfway down page 13 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We're going to start when Mr. Tumnus meets Lucy and up to the point that he invites her back to his home. And we're going to write that scene in first person from Mr. Tumnus's point of view. Now, before we do that, we need to have some kind of brainstorm about what's this going to look like from his point of view. We need to do a character analysis. That means we need to think critically about our character. And so what we're going to do, as if you were in my class, you know I love graphic organizers, and graphic organizers are a little bit more difficult to do through virtual, but we're going to still try to do some because I think it really helps us get all our information down. And if you do a graphic organizer well, then you can write your essay or your narrative from that organizer. You don't have to have as many rough drafts and redrafts if you do the work through the organizer. Okay, and especially because on the LEAP you're going to be timed, you need to be able to do this pretty quickly. And so that's why we try to get used to using our organizers for our brainstorm and to use what we write down to write our actual writing task. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to take something I've learned and kind of tweak it a little bit for this assignment. When you have to analyze a character, one of the easiest things I think to do is to do this little thing here. It's kind of an outline of a person's head. I know it's not very good. You're not trying to make it perfect. I also think it looks kind of like a road that you're going around. And so we're going to analyze our character, but we're going to only analyze from this scene. Now, we read all of chapter 2, so we know all about Mr. Tumnus. We know that Mr. Tumnus is nice and friendly, but we also know he's in service to the White Witch and that he's supposed to kidnap Lucy. And so we need that to be reflected in the scene we're going to write. If you reread the beginning of chapter 2 where Mr. Tumnus meets Lucy, obviously none of this is coming out because it's all from Lucy's point of view. But we want that to be reflected. We want that to be reflected in our writing, that Mr. Tumnus has more going on. So here's what we're going to do. On the outside, we're going to write the things that we know actually happen. And then on the inside, we're going to write what Mr. Tumnus is going to be thinking. From what we know from the end of chapter 2, what would be going through his mind at the beginning. So we're going to start, and what I like to do is also think about this. My writing, my beginning, my middle, and my end. And that will help me kind of organize my thoughts when I have to actually write paragraphs. So okay, what happens at the beginning? We have Lucy meets Tumnus. Okay, and when you're doing this, I always have my culminating writing task. I'm going to show you my paper. I always have my paper, my culminating writing task. I have my text, and I have my notebook that I'm doing this in, even though I'm doing this on a board. You always want that book right there to refer back to it. Okay, so they say hello to each other. Tumnus asks Lucy if she is human. Okay, so we're going to have that. That's one of the things that happens in the text. Because what we're going to do, even though we're writing from a different character's point of view, we have to maintain all the things that would be in the scene regardless. And then we're going to look at Mr. Tumnus's point of view after that. Okay, so what else happens? They introduce one another, and then Narnia is mentioned, and so Mr. Tumnus has to tell Lucy that she's in Narnia, and then he tells her about where Narnia is and the fact that it's winter. He seems to misunderstand. He doesn't quite understand where Lucy's from. Remember, he thinks that she's from the land of War, Drobe, and Spare, So he misunderstands where she's from. And then he invites, Mr. Tumnus invites Lucy back to his home. Okay, so Lucy meets Mr. Tumnus. Tumnus asks Lucy if she's human. They start talking about Narnia. He doesn't quite understand where Lucy comes from, and then he invites Lucy back to his home. And then, let's see. Lucy takes his arm And off they go. Okay, so I can even kind of split this down. Beginning, middle, end. Because when you're telling a story, a narrative is a story, you want to kind of be able to think, okay, what's going to be the beginning, what's going to be the middle, what's going to be the end of my narrative, of my story. And we already have been given the format because we're not having to make the story up completely ourselves, but we need to think about, okay, how is this going to be different from Mr. Tumnus's point of view? Okay, I also might want to look at, is there any dialogue that I think is important? So he asked how she comes into Narnia. When he asks about her being human, I might want to include the daughter of Eve. I'm going to put D-O-E, daughter of Eve, that language, because that's how he approaches it. And the fact that it's always winter in Narnia, he mentions that. Okay, so this is the basics. This is like we could write a summary of chapter 2, of the first half of chapter 2 from this. Okay, now here's what we're going to do that's different, because we're doing a character analysis. We want to think about what's going on in Mr. Tumnus's point of view, in his mind. And we're going to do that on the inside. So if we think about this as the outline, this is all the stuff that happens outside Mr. Tumnus, because he's just standing there, because that chapter is not from his point of view. But now we want to get into his head. Okay? So for all of these, think about how Mr. Tumnus would be reacting. So Lucy meets Tumnus, and then he asks if she's a daughter of Eve. So now that we know from the chapter that he's shocked, but now that we know that he's in service to the White Witch, what things might he be thinking? So he might be shocked to see a human, and then he's telling her about Narnia. Now, what do we know about Narnia? It's under the spell of the White Witch. We know that later because he tells it to us, but Lucy doesn't know that, but he does, so we might have that. So he's thinking about the witch ruling over Narnia. Okay, if he knows she's a human, he's thinking about the witch, what do you think's going on in his mind? What he's supposed to do? He's supposed to kidnap her. But is Mr. Tumnus a good guy or a bad guy? Even though he's in service to the White Witch, is he good or bad? He's good. And so because we know he's good, we should have conflict. Because if he were just a bad person, he'd be like, oh good, it's a human girl, I'm going to kidnap her. But instead, let's think about, how do you think Mr. Tumnus views Lucy? She is a nice girl. And he's thinking about the witches ruling over Narnia. And so we're doing first person, so let's think about what might he say. I'm going to put this in quotations. I'm supposed to take this girl. But, and then I might point to the fact that she's nice. So now we're getting in his mind during this scene. And he doesn't seem to know what to do. That's why later on he's crying. So maybe having him question what's going to happen. And then off they go. Okay, so I have all the basics that happen in the first half of chapter 2 on the outside. And then I have his thought process on the inside. There's one other thing you might want to do when you're doing a narrative, and that is you want to think about your sensory details. Sensory means your senses, your 5 senses. And sometimes I'll even have students in their notebook, when they have to write a narrative, I'll have them trace out their hand for the 5 senses, and I'll say, okay, let's think about those things. So like during these scenes, I'm going to use red for my senses. What things might my character be seeing, tasting, smelling, hearing, and feeling? Not feeling like emotions, but feeling like touching. So I might think about Mr. Tumnus dropping his parcels. So think about how that might feel, that brown paper that he's picking up. Think about the coldness of the snow on the ground. So I might think about snow. Sight. He might think, how strange. This human creature looks. So that's kind of our sight. We could also go with feeling. He might think about how it feels for Lucy to touch his arm. So we might write about that. And holding the feel of the umbrella over both of them. Taste, not so much. Now, taste, if I were to write about when they go back to his house and they have tea and they have cakes and they have sardines, I might talk about taste a bit more. And some of my students, when they have to write this scene, they'll talk about him tasting snow on the tip of his tongue or something like that. Those are those sensory details that just make my writing more interesting. And C.S. Lewis uses a lot of sensory details. He talks about the way things look. He talks about the way things feel, especially in this harsh winter of Narnia. When changes happen, he's going to talk about the things that people see. And when there is a meal, as we're going to see in the next couple chapters, as well as in chapter 2, when there's any kind of food, he really describes the meal and all the things that people have. And in one chapter, he describes the preparation for a dinner and how much work it goes into the dinner, and the pots and the pans and the cups and the saucers, and then all the foods that they eat. And so sensory details really make a writing come alive. And so we're going to use this to write our culminating writing task. And we'll do that in the next lesson.